Hey, welcome back. It's a fun idea if you share where you're listening from today. Thanks. Hit like and subscribe. Let's get cozy and begin. There's something oddly comforting about routine. Every morning, I wake up at 6 a.m. sharp. The shrill beep of the alarm barely startles me anymore. It's the signal to begin another day, one that unfolds with meticulous precision. I shower, shave, and dress in clothes pressed the night before. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafts through the house, a silent ritual my wife and I have shared for years. Leah always stirs around 6:30, just after I've poured the first cup. Our mornings used to be filled with easy conversation, plans for the day, a shared laugh over something trivial. Lately, though, it's felt like I'm living with a ghost. Leah's smile feels practiced, her words rehearsed, as if they're part of a script she's lost interest in following. She doesn't look at me the same way anymore, if she looks at me at all. I've noticed the signs. The longer hours she's been putting in at work, the last-minute business trips, the way she slips out of the room when a call comes in after dinner. I'm not stupid, but it's amazing how easy it is to convince yourself that everything's fine. People do that, don't they? You convince yourself the cracks are small enough to ignore, because if you acknowledge them, the whole structure might collapse. The first time I felt something was truly off was a few months ago. Leah was sitting across from me at the dining table, twirling her fork absently in her salad. Her phone buzzed, lighting up the dark wood beside her plate. She barely glanced at it, but something in her eyes flickered. Hesitation. I didn't press her on it. I figured it was work stress. I rationalized it the way any trusting husband would. She used to confide in me when work was overwhelming. We'd talk late into the night, problem solving together, her head resting on my shoulder as we both brainstormed ways to handle her latest campaign or office drama. But lately when I asked, she'd brush it off, giving me a curt, "It's fine," before changing the subject. At first I didn't think much of it. People get busy, but those curt responses began to pile up. It's strange how quickly silence can replace intimacy. I kept telling myself that I was overthinking it, that all marriages go through ups and downs, and maybe this was just one of those low points. 8 years together had taught me that love wasn't always perfect, but there was something about the way Leah had become distant, something I couldn't quite place. She'd started to disappear in a way that had nothing to do with the long hours or the trips out of town. It was as if she was here, but she wasn't. There were other things too, things that at the time seemed like small, disconnected moments. I remember walking into the kitchen one evening and catching Leah quickly sliding her phone into her purse. She smiled at me, the kind of smile that almost made me believe nothing was wrong. Almost. "Just work," she said casually, as if I'd asked. I hadn't. You'd think after all these years I'd be more perceptive, but sometimes you don't see the obvious when you're standing too close to it. I should have questioned it more, should have seen the signs for what they were, but I didn't. Maybe I wasn't ready to acknowledge what was happening right in front of me. Denial has a way of wrapping around you like a warm blanket, offering comfort in the form of willful ignorance. Still, it's hard to deny the subtle distance growing between us. There's the way Leah sits on the far end of the couch now when we watch TV together, her body angled away from mine. The way she flinches just slightly when I reach out to touch her arm. I've always been a methodical person. It's probably why I'm good at my job. Software development isn't about rushing. It's about careful planning, analyzing every line of code to see where the bugs hide. Fixing things is what I do. So I've begun to catalog Leah's behaviors in much the same way, quietly observing without confrontation. She's been coming home later and later. I hear the way her voice changes when she answers certain calls, softer, almost secretive. She tells me it's nothing, and I nod along because that's what I'm supposed to do. But I've started taking mental notes, storing every moment away. I'm not suspicious yet, but I'm prepared for what I know is coming. The routine I've relied on for years has shifted, and I'm not sure when it will break, but I know it's only a matter of time. And when it does break, I'll be ready. It was late, past midnight, and Leah had already drifted off to sleep. I lay beside her, the glow from her phone casting faint light onto the nightstand. That familiar buzz echoed through the stillness of the room. its vibrations oddly loud in the silence. I knew I shouldn't reach for it. I'd never been the type to snoop, always believing in trust, but something gnawed at me, a kind of itch at the back of my mind I couldn't ignore anymore. Without thinking, I leaned over and slid her phone into my hand. It was an automatic movement, smooth like I'd done it 100 times before, though this was the first. The screen lit up with a notification, a hotel confirmation. I blinked at the message, my brain scrambling to make sense of it. Leah hadn't mentioned any trips recently, and the dates didn't line up with anything she'd told me. I opened the message. The reservation was for a boutique hotel downtown, 2 nights booked for the coming weekend. The problem was, Leah had told me she'd be in San Francisco for a work event on those very same days. That same gnawing feeling intensified. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I was no longer just holding a phone, I was holding the proof of something darker. I stared at the words on the screen for what felt like hours trying to process them. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears, my breath shallow and rapid, but the realization didn't hit me all at once. Instead, it dripped in, slow, like water seeping through cracks. I didn't want to believe it. She couldn't be lying, she wouldn't. But the confirmation didn't lie. I felt my hand tighten around the phone, and for a brief, wild moment, I considered waking her up right then, shoving the evidence in her face and demanding answers. But I didn't. I set the phone back down as gently as I could, placing it exactly where I found it. The urge to confront her, to rage at her, passed almost as quickly as it came. I wasn't going to yell, I wasn't going to explode, I was going to think. I turned away from her, staring at the ceiling, my mind working faster than it had in years. If Leah was cheating on me, then I couldn't just confront her blindly. That would be giving her too much control. No, if this was happening, I needed to be sure, absolutely sure, and I needed to be ready. From that night on, I began gathering information piece by piece, like building a puzzle, except this one was a portrait of betrayal. Leah never knew that I was watching her more closely than ever before. When she left for work, I would check her email. It wasn't difficult. I knew her passwords, had known them for years. I wasn't a man prone to paranoia, but now every shred of data felt like a clue I needed to piece together the truth. Her inbox was full of the usual work emails, but buried in the threads was another booking. A reservation at the same hotel, this time under a different name. Mark. It didn't take long to figure out who he was. Leah had mentioned him a few times in passing. Mark from marketing, she called him. Another executive she had worked closely with. Someone who, according to her, was just a colleague. Only now, he wasn't just a colleague, he was something more. The confirmation hit me harder than I expected. I thought I was prepared, thought I had already steeled myself for the possibility, but staring at the email felt like a punch to the gut. Still, I swallowed it down, pushing the emotion deep inside where it couldn't hurt me. I wasn't going to let myself spiral. I wasn't going to break. Instead, I made a plan. I started small. Leah didn't need to know that I was on to her. Not yet. I continued acting as though nothing was wrong, kept my same routines, the same conversations. But beneath the surface, I was watching her every move. She still took those late-night calls to them, often stepping outside with a forced casualness that I now saw for what it was, a pathetic attempt to hide the truth. One evening after she claimed she was going out for drinks with some colleagues, I followed her. I stayed far enough back that she wouldn't see me. Her car snaked through the streets until it stopped outside a restaurant I didn't recognize. From the shadows, I watched her enter. Minutes later, Mark joined her at the table by the window. They didn't touch, not in a way that would have given them away immediately, but the way they leaned in close, their shared laughter, the intimacy in their body language, told me everything I needed to know. They were careful, but not careful enough. I returned home before she did, sitting at the kitchen table, pretending to read a book while my mind worked through what I'd seen. The rage that should have been there was absent. Instead, I felt cold, detached, like I was watching it happen to someone else. She walked through the door, smiled at me in that same practiced way, and I smiled back. For now, I'd let her believe she was safe. Let her keep her secret. The next few weeks were a slow, quiet investigation. I gathered every shred of evidence, emails, text messages, receipts, keeping it all tucked away in a folder on my work computer, locked behind a password Leah wouldn't even think to look for. I learned about their meetups, their weekends away. It was all there, the proof of her betrayal laid out in cold, factual detail. I knew the affair was real now. There was no doubt left. But I didn't want to rush into anything. A confrontation wouldn't give me what I wanted. I wanted control. I wanted to dismantle her life the way she'd so carelessly dismantled our marriage. But I couldn't be impulsive. That wasn't me. I was methodical. I needed to approach this carefully, strategically, the way I approached everything else in life. There were rules to this kind of game, and if I was going to win, I had to play it perfectly. Each time she came home late, I cataloged it. Every time she lied about where she had been, I logged the details. I even checked her social media, combing through photos and comments for any clues, any discrepancies in her timeline. Every action she took, I was there, quietly observing, building my case, and Leah had no idea. There were times when I wanted to confront her, to just throw it all out in the open. The temptation gnawed at me constantly, especially when she would walk into the room smiling, playing the part of the devoted wife. But I knew better. I knew that confronting her would only lead to excuses, tears, maybe even apologies. And I didn't want her apologies. I didn't want her guilt. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done without the comfort of an easy resolution. So I waited. I didn't tell anyone. There was no reason to involve others yet. I could have confided in a friend, let them share in my indignation, but that felt weak, like I needed someone else to validate what I was feeling. I didn't. This was between me and Leah, and in time I would make sure she understood exactly what she'd done. The longer I watched her, the more detached I became. I wasn't the hurt husband anymore. I was something else, something colder. I had all the evidence I needed now, but I wasn't finished. I wasn't going to settle for simple answers or emotional outbursts. That would be too easy. What I wanted was more than an explanation. I wanted her to feel what I had felt, only worse. This wasn't about forgiveness or moving on. This was about control. After I confirmed Leah's affair with Mark, I didn't rush into anything. Confronting her would have been satisfying in the moment, but too messy. Instead, I focused on what I do best, planning. I knew that if I was going to take control of the situation, I had to be patient, methodical. Leah was already living in her own lie. I needed to let that continue long enough for her to hang herself with it. I started with small, subtle steps. The first thing I did was place a GPS tracker on her car. It was almost too easy. One evening when she went out to meet a friend from work, I installed it without breaking a sweat. It was a nondescript little device, barely larger than a matchbox, that I placed under the rear bumper. From that moment on, I had a map of her movements, where she went, how long she stayed, when she left. I made sure never to check it when she was around, only doing so when I was at work or late at night when she was asleep. She followed the same predictable patterns. Dinner at some nice restaurant with Mark, then off to one of the boutique hotels scattered around town. It was all so neat and pathetic. She thought she was so clever, so secretive, but with every move she became more transparent. The more I observed, the less I felt anything for her. What had once been love had curdled into something cold and distant, but no less intense. I wasn't sad anymore. I was calculating. In between tracking her movements, I combed through her email and social media accounts. There was nothing overt at first, but once I knew what to look for, the clues were all there. Messages about work dinners that didn't line up with her actual schedule, excuses for staying late that were obviously orchestrated. Leah wasn't particularly careful, and that made my job easy. She never noticed that I was watching, because I didn't give her any reason to suspect me. I was the same Daniel, polite, supportive, and distant in the way she had become used to. We still shared meals, still slept in the same bed, though I hadn't touched her in weeks. I doubt she even realized it. She was too wrapped up in her secret world with Mark to care. It didn't take long before I began to escalate my plan. Observation wasn't enough. I needed to start dismantling her life piece by piece, but in ways she wouldn't immediately connect to me. I couldn't afford a mistake. First, I began working on her professional life. Leah prided herself on being competent, on her flawless reputation at the office. She had always been meticulous, rising quickly in her career as a marketing executive, and I knew that's where she was most vulnerable. I created an anonymous email account and started sending messages to her boss. The emails were subtle, just enough to plant seeds of doubt about Leah's reliability. The first email suggested that she'd been using company resources for personal trips, even attaching a doctored copy of one of her hotel receipts. I didn't go overboard. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I chose my words carefully, suggesting that I was a concerned colleague who didn't want to see the company suffer because of someone's poor decisions. It worked. Within a week, Leah started coming home frustrated, complaining about how her boss had begun questioning her about expenses. "They're nitpicking," she said, her voice tinged with indignation. "It's like they think I'm doing something wrong." I smiled sympathetically, offering her the kind of hollow reassurance she expected from me. I could see the stress starting to build. She wasn't used to being under scrutiny, and it was starting to get to her. Next, I made small changes to her routine at home. I started moving things around, misplacing her work documents, shifting appointments in her calendar, and deleting important contacts from her phone. They were all minor enough that she didn't suspect sabotage, but they added to her growing sense of unease. She'd search the house for hours looking for a report she swore she had left on the kitchen counter, or she'd miss a meeting because the reminder in her phone had mysteriously disappeared. I watched her unravel slowly, piece by piece, while I remained calm and composed. Leah's professional facade was cracking, and she didn't even realize that I was the one doing the damage. The chaos I was creating extended beyond her career. Her social life began to take hits as well. Leah had always been proud of her carefully curated image, the perfect wife with the perfect job, surrounded by friends who admired her. I knew that breaking that image would devastate her, so I started planting rumors. Subtle, quiet whispers spread among our mutual friends. I casually mentioned to one of her closest confidants that Leah had been acting distant lately, that I was worried about her, and that I suspected she might be having an affair. I did it in a way that made me seem vulnerable and concerned, and of course the friend promised not to say a word to anyone. But secrets never stay hidden for long. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. I made sure to stoke the flames just enough, planting doubts in the minds of her friends without ever implicating myself. Leah began to notice the shift in how people treated her. Invitations to social events dried up, and her once close circle of friends started to pull away. She confided in me one evening, saying how she didn't understand why people had become so distant. "I feel like something's off, Daniel," she said, her eyes filled with frustration. "People are acting weird around me." I nodded sympathetically, playing the role of the supportive husband. Inside, I felt nothing but satisfaction. While her social life was crumbling, her relationship with Mark was beginning to show cracks as well. I made sure of that. I couldn't afford to let their little romance flourish while I dismantled everything else. So I began leaving subtle traces, anonymous texts, vague messages that hinted at Mark's own infidelity. I knew he had a girlfriend, someone he'd been seeing on the side while he and Leah carried on their affair. I made sure that Leah found out about her, though not directly from me. I let her discover it the same way she discovered me. The hotel receipts, the messages, all planted carefully, deliberately. She never suspected I was behind it. Their meetings became less frequent after that, strained and tense. Leah would come home late, her face set in a hard line, and I knew that things with Mark were starting to fall apart. She didn't talk to me about it, of course. She couldn't. I was still the loving husband, the one she couldn't betray without consequence. The pressure was building, and Leah was starting to crack under it. She didn't understand why everything was going wrong all at once. Her job, her friendships, her affair. It was all falling apart, and she was at the center of it, desperately trying to hold it together. I took satisfaction in the knowledge that I was behind it all. Every missed opportunity at work, every awkward encounter with a friend, every argument with Mark. I had orchestrated it, and yet I remained the supportive, reliable husband. She leaned on me more as her world began to crumble, and I let her. One night, she broke down completely. She came home late, tears streaming down her face, and collapsed onto the couch. "Everything is falling apart," she sobbed. I don't know what to do. I sat beside her, gently rubbing her back, whispering empty reassurances. Inside, I felt nothing. This was exactly what I wanted. The woman who had betrayed me was now unraveling, and she had no idea that I was the one pulling the strings. But I wasn't done yet. The next phase of my plan is to escalate the sabotage at work. I had already planted the seeds of doubt in her boss's mind, but now I needed to make sure those doubts became full-blown accusations. I began sending more emails, this time with more serious claims. I suggested that Leah had been leaking company secrets, subtly implying that she was involved in some shady dealings with a competitor. I knew these accusations would be hard to prove, but that wasn't the point. The goal was to create enough suspicion that her boss couldn't ignore it. Leah's once perfect reputation was already tarnished, and this was the final push she needed to lose control completely. A few days later, she came home, her face pale and drawn. She sat down at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. "I think I'm going to lose my job," she whispered. I acted surprised. "What? Why, what happened?" "They're accusing me of things I didn't do," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't understand any of it. It's like someone is out to get me." I almost laughed at the irony of it. Someone was out to get her, but she had no idea it was me. I put my arms around her, pulling her close. "We'll figure it out," I said softly. "You're strong. You'll get through this." But I knew she wouldn't. She was too far gone, and I wasn't going to be able to stop until her life was in ruins. The next few weeks were a blur of chaos for Leah. She lost her job after an internal investigation turned up irregularities in her work. Her friends continued to distance themselves, and Mark had completely disappeared from her life. She was left isolated, broken, and dependent on me, the one person she thought she could still trust. And I wasn't done yet. Leah's life was unraveling, but I was far from finished. The pieces were falling into place, but the final act was yet to come. I had more to take from her, more damage to inflict. I wasn't just going to ruin her, I was going to destroy her. And she would never see it coming. The first signs of Leah's unraveling were subtle, but I noticed them immediately. She came home one evening, her usually composed expression fractured by a faint line of tension between her brows. She'd forgotten her phone on the kitchen counter, and while she was in the shower, a message notification appeared. The text was from Mark, terse and frustrated, something about how she was never around when he needed her, and how everything was falling apart. It seemed like their little love affair was beginning to crumble under the weight of the chaos I had set in motion. I deleted the message before Leah could see it. I didn't need her realizing that things were starting to slip out of her control. Not yet. I wanted her to feel completely blindsided when the final blow came. It was a slow burn, watching her carefully cultivated world begin to deteriorate bit by bit. Every day brought new signs of stress. She'd misplace things more often, important documents for work, her keys, her phone. She seemed constantly on edge, and I, ever the doting husband, was always there to reassure her. "Maybe you're just tired," I'd say, handing her a cup of tea as she sat with her head in her hands, sighing about the growing pressures at the office. But it wasn't just exhaustion. It was the slow, methodical unraveling of her carefully balanced life. At work, the seeds of doubt I had planted in her boss's mind were starting to sprout. Leah had always been the golden employee, the one everyone could count on, the one who stayed late and brought in big clients. But now she was starting to slip. Missed deadlines, botched presentations, and accidental misunderstandings began to pile up. Some of those misunderstandings were, of course, my doing. An anonymous email here, a misplaced file there. just enough to raise eyebrows without raising outright accusations. Leah came home later and later, her face set in a tight mask of frustration. I watched her pace the living room, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in hushed, frantic tones as she tried to salvage her professional reputation. It was slipping through her fingers, and she had no idea why. She'd grown used to success, to everything falling into place for her. Now nothing was working. The harder she tried to fix things, the more tangled everything became. I played the role of the supportive husband perfectly. When Leah sat on the edge of our bed at night, shoulders slumped and eyes dull with exhaustion, I would reach over and rub her back, my voice a soothing murmur. "You'll figure it out," I'd tell her, even as I knew she wouldn't. "It's just a rough patch." And she believed me. She had no choice. I was her last lifeline in a world that was slowly turning on her. Her relationship with Mark, too, was on shaky ground. I made sure of that. The anonymous texts I sent to his girlfriend, photos of Leah and Mark together, fabricated stories of their late-night rendezvous, had worked like a charm. His girlfriend broke things off with him, and Leah, already overwhelmed with her crumbling career, now had to deal with Mark's increasing distance. Their little affair had once been a sanctuary for both of them, a place to escape the pressures of their real lives. Now it was just another source of stress. Mark stopped answering her calls as frequently. Their meetings became fewer and further between, and when they did meet, it was obvious that the spark had dimmed. I could see the frustration in Leah's eyes when she came home after one of their brief encounters. She was losing him too, and she didn't understand why. She had no idea that I was behind it all, pulling the strings, orchestrating her downfall with a precision that would have made me proud under different circumstances. The beauty of it was that Leah had nowhere to turn. Her friends had grown distant, thanks to the rumors I'd quietly spread about her. Little whispers about her unreliability, her late nights with Mark, her supposed erratic behavior. People started to pull away from her, unsure of whether the woman they thought they knew could be trusted. It didn't take much to sow doubt in their minds, just a few well-placed comments during casual conversations. Leah began to confide in me more and more. She'd sit across from me at the dinner table, her eyes glassy with fatigue and confusion, telling me how she didn't understand why everything was falling apart. "I don't get it, Daniel," she'd say, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like everything's slipping through my fingers." I'd nod sympathetically, offering her vague reassurances, but inside, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. This was what I had wanted. Leah's perfect little world was collapsing around her, and she had no idea that I was the one who had started the avalanche. But I wasn't done. There was still more to do. I began escalating my sabotage at work. The rumors I'd spread about Leah's professional incompetence were no longer enough. I needed to make sure she lost everything. So I started sending more aggressive emails to her boss, still under the guise of an anonymous whistleblower. I fabricated evidence of Leah leaking confidential information to competitors, even creating fake email chains to back up my claims. Her boss called her in for a meeting one Friday afternoon. Leah came home that evening looking pale and shaken. She barely spoke as she dropped her bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the wall. I sat beside her, gently touching her hand. "What happened?" I asked, feigning concern. "They're suspending me," she whispered, her voice hollow. "They're saying I've been sharing confidential information. I don't even know how to defend myself. I don't know where this is coming from." I squeezed her hand, suppressing the urge to smile. "I'm so sorry," I said softly, rubbing her back in what I hope was a comforting gesture. In the days that followed, Leah's suspension became the final nail in the coffin of her career. Her boss, already skeptical of her recent performance, didn't hesitate to push for her termination. A few days later, Leah received the call. She'd been fired. Her career, the one she had spent years building, was over. Leah didn't cry when she told me. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She seemed almost numb, as if the weight of everything that had happened was too much to process. "I don't know what to do now," she said quietly, staring into the distance. I played my part perfectly, sitting across from her, nodding in sympathy. But inside, I was already moving on to the next phase of my plan. Her career was gone, her affair with Mark was crumbling, and her social circle had all but disappeared. Leah was isolated, alone, and desperate, and that's exactly where I wanted her. The final step was to break her completely, to make her realize that she had lost everything, not just because of her actions, but because I had taken it all from her. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she had done to me, to us, and I wanted her to understand that there was no coming back from it. I began to manipulate her environment even more. I'd move her things around the house, hide important documents, change the settings on her phone, and delete messages before she saw them. It was small, petty, but it added to her growing paranoia. Leah became increasingly jumpy, forgetting things, misplacing items, and constantly questioning herself. "Am I going crazy?" she asked me one night, her voice shaky. "I feel like I'm losing my mind." I smiled at her, my face a mask of concern. "You're just stressed," I said gently. "Everything's been so hard lately. It's normal to feel overwhelmed." She nodded, though I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She was starting to doubt herself, to wonder if maybe she was losing her grip on reality. It was perfect. I kept the pressure on, pushing her closer and closer to the edge without ever letting her know that I was the one behind it all. Leah was unraveling faster than I had expected, and it wouldn't be long before she broke completely. Then came the day I had been waiting for. It was a Saturday evening. We were hosting a small dinner party with a few of our remaining friends, those who hadn't yet drifted away from Leah. I had planned everything perfectly. As we all sat around the table, laughing and chatting, I waited for the right moment to make my move. Leah had been quiet all evening, clearly still reeling from the events of the past few weeks. She looked exhausted, her smile forced, her laughter hollow. I could see the cracks in her facade, and I knew that tonight was the night I would shatter it completely. After the main course had been cleared away, I stood up, raising my glass for a toast. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at me. "I just want to take a moment," I began, my voice calm and steady, "to thank everyone for being here tonight. It's been a tough few months for Leah and me, but we've gotten through it together." I glanced at Leah, who smiled weakly at me, clearly confused about where I was going with this. I raised my glass higher. "And I think it's time that we talk about the truth." The room was utterly silent now, all eyes on me. Leah's smile faltered, her confusion deepening. "The truth is," I continued, turning to face her, "Leah's been having an affair." Gasps echoed around the table, but I didn't stop. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the stack of evidence I had been gathering for months. Emails, photos, receipts. I laid them out on the table in front of her. One by one, Leah's face drained of color as she stared at the evidence, her hands trembling. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock and horror. "I know everything, Leah," I said, my voice low and cold. "I've known for months." The silence in the room was suffocating. Leah didn't say a word. She couldn't. She was completely and utterly destroyed, and I had won. Leah's professional life was disintegrating faster than even I had anticipated. The gossip, the missed opportunities, the subtle but targeted sabotage I had set in motion began to pick up momentum. I watched her spiral, her confidence eroding with every mistake, every raised eyebrow from colleagues she once held in her pocket. She had no idea why things were slipping away, and that was the best part, her confusion. It added to the sweet taste of control, the knowledge that I was the one pulling every string. She tried to fight it at first. I'd hear her on the phone late into the night, speaking with her boss or colleagues, desperately attempting to mend her reputation. She blamed the sudden shift on a streak of bad luck, on being overwhelmed by her work. Of course, none of it made a difference. I had ensured that the narrative of her decline was too strong, too well crafted to be undone by a few apologies or extra hours of work. "You just need to give it time," I told her one evening, my tone dripping with faux sympathy. "You're under a lot of stress. Maybe a break would help." She glanced at me, her eyes hollow and red from crying. "It's not just stress, Daniel. I don't understand what's happening. It's like everything is slipping away. and I can't catch it. I placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a comforting squeeze. You'll get through it. I'm here for you. She believed me. She had to. I was her only lifeline, her anchor in the storm that I had unleashed. And that was the way I wanted it. Her reliance on me to grow as her world crumbled, piece by piece. But it wasn't enough. I didn't want to simply watch her suffer in private. I wanted the public humiliation, the unraveling of her social standing, her friendships. Leah had always held such pride in how she managed to keep her professional and personal life so well aligned, perfectly balanced. She was the image of success, both at work and in her personal life. That image was fragile, though, and I was about to shatter it completely. I began by planting subtle doubts among her friends. Over drinks with a few mutual acquaintances, I'd let slip how worried I was about Leah. She's been so distant lately, I'd say, lowering my voice just enough to convey a hint of concern. I don't know what's going on with her. It's like she's not herself anymore. They'd nod, offer murmurs of agreement or concern, and then, just as planned, the whispers would start. Leah's behavior at work, her unexplained absences, her erratic emotional state, all of it added up in the eyes of her friends. They began pulling away, unsure of what to make of her anymore. Even her relationship with Mark, the man she had risked everything for, was beginning to crack under the pressure. I had made sure of that. I'd sent a series of anonymous messages to his girlfriend, hinting at Leah's infidelity, carefully chosen words that stoked the fires of suspicion without ever revealing the full truth. It wasn't long before Mark's girlfriend confronted him, and while he initially denied everything, the strain it placed on their relationship was obvious. Leah, of course, had no idea why Mark had suddenly become more distant. She'd come home late after their meetups, her face lined with frustration, and collapse onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. Mark's been acting strange, she muttered one evening, half to herself, half to me. I don't understand it. Things were fine. But now, I said nothing, only nodded, offering her the space to vent. She didn't need my input. She needed my silent, unwavering support. The irony wasn't lost on me, her turning to me, the man she had betrayed, for comfort. Her professional downfall had come quickly, and now her personal life was beginning to follow the same path. Mark was no longer the comforting escape he once had been, and her friends were starting to distance themselves more and more. Leah was increasingly isolated, adrift in a sea of confusion, and it was all by design. The walls were closing in, and there was nowhere for her to run. One evening, a few weeks after her suspension, Leah came home to find a carefully placed envelope on the kitchen table. She stared at it for a moment, suspicion creeping across her face. She recognized the handwriting. It was Mark's. Inside, there was a letter, cold and clinical, explaining that he could no longer continue their relationship. The pressure from his girlfriend, the rumors that had started to swirl, the complications at work, it was too much. He had to think about his future. I watched from the corner of the room as Leah read the letter. Her face remained unreadable for a moment, and then it crumpled, the weight of everything finally crashing down on her. He ended it, she whispered, almost to herself. I took a step forward, careful to keep my expression neutral, but inside, I was savoring the moment. I'm sorry, I said, keeping my voice soft and measured. She didn't look at me. She just sat down at the table, staring at the letter in front of her, her fingers trembling as she clutched the paper. She was silent for a long time, her mind undoubtedly reeling from everything that had happened. Her career, her affair, her friends, it had all slipped through her fingers, just as I had intended. The next phase of my plan was already in motion. Leah's professional reputation was in ruins, and she had lost her closest personal connections. But I wasn't done. I needed to ensure that the final blow was public, that her humiliation was complete and undeniable. I started reaching out to more of our mutual friends, under the guise of concern. I think Leah's been struggling, I told them, feigning a heavy sigh. She's been going through so much lately, and I'm not sure she's coping well. The sympathy from them was immediate, but so was the distance. People didn't like being around failure. especially when that failure was wrapped in scandal. The rumors I had planted months ago had taken root, and now they were beginning to bloom. Leah started to notice the shift. Invitations to dinners, parties, and events dried up. Friends who once texted her daily were now silent. She would check her phone obsessively, waiting for messages that never came. I could see the hurt in her eyes, the growing realization that her once vibrant social life was disintegrating. One evening, after another long, silent dinner, Leah turned to me, her voice small and broken. "I feel like everyone's abandoned me," she says. "Bye to shy away the time. Boy, bye." I said, like, "I've done something wrong, but I don't even know what." I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence hang in the air between us, letting her stew in her own confusion and despair. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, measured. "Maybe they just don't know how to help you," I said. "Maybe they think you've been distant." She frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Distant?" I nodded. "You've been dealing with so much, your job, Mark, everything. Maybe people just don't know how to reach out to you." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression one of uncertainty. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, trying to process everything that had happened, trying to piece together the fragments of her life that no longer fit. But there was no fitting them back together. Not anymore. The final act of her unraveling came at a dinner party we were hosting, a small gathering of what few friends remained. I had been planning this moment for months, and now it was time to execute it. As we sat around the table, laughter and conversation filling the air, I waited for the perfect moment. Leah was distracted, her smile strained, her mind undoubtedly occupied by the chaos of her life. She hadn't fully noticed how many people were missing, how her once large circle of friends had dwindled down to just a few. I stood up, raising my glass for a toast. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to me. "I just wanted to thank everyone for being here tonight," I began, my tone light and casual. "It's been a rough few months for Leah and me, but we've gotten through it together." Leah looked up at me, her smile faltering as she sensed something was off. "And I think it's time we talk about the truth," I continued, my voice dropping just slightly, enough to draw everyone's attention. The room was utterly silent now, the tension palpable. Leah's eyes widened in confusion, her body tensing as she waited for what I was about to say. "The truth is," I said, turning to face her directly, "Leah's been having an affair." Gasps echoed around the table, but I didn't stop. I pulled out the folder of evidence I had been collecting for months, photos, emails, receipts. I laid them out on the table in front of her, one by one, each piece of paper a carefully calculated blow. Leah's face drained of color as she stared at the evidence, her hands shaking as she reached for the papers. "I know everything," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I've known for months." The silence that followed was deafening. Leah didn't speak. She couldn't. She was too stunned, too broken to respond. And that was exactly what I had wanted. Her life was in ruins, her reputation destroyed, her secrets laid bare for all to see. There was no coming back from this. No redemption, no forgiveness. I had made sure of that. As I watched her crumble, I felt a sense of satisfaction wash over me. The plan had worked perfectly. I had taken everything from her, just as she had taken everything from me. But as the night wore on and the guests left one by one, I found myself alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty wine glasses and discarded plates. The satisfaction I had felt earlier began to fade, replaced by something colder, emptier. I had won. I had destroyed her. So why didn't it feel like enough? The dinner party had ended hours ago, but I still sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty wine glasses and scattered plates. The soft ticking of the clock was the only sound breaking the silence. Leah had retreated to the bedroom, where I imagined she was sitting on the edge of the bed, numb, unable to process the extent of what had just happened. The scene replayed in my mind like a perfect script. The moment her face crumbled as I laid out every piece of evidence, each one a strike she never saw coming. Her affair, her lies, her deception, all exposed in front of the few remaining people in our lives. I had watched her, expressionless as she tried to speak, but no words came. There was nothing left for her to say. She was finished. As I sat there, the satisfaction I had expected to feel had begun to slip through my fingers, just as it had after I destroyed her career, after I planted doubts in her friends' minds. I had executed my plan flawlessly, dismantling her life piece by piece until there was nothing left. And now I had delivered the final blow in front of everyone. Leah's public humiliation was complete, but sitting there alone in the aftermath, I was haunted by the emptiness creeping into the edges of my mind. I had won. So why did it feel like I had lost something too? I pushed the thought aside, rising from the table and walking through the now quiet house. The soft glow from the living room lamp cast shadows on the walls, stretching and bending in the silence. Everything felt still, too still, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I made my way down the hallway and paused outside the bedroom door. Through the crack, I could see Leah sitting exactly where I had imagined, her back to me. Her shoulders were hunched, her head down. She hadn't moved since she left the table, and part of me wondered if she even could. I had taken everything from her. For a moment, I felt a pang of something, a flicker of the old emotions I had buried so deep. Guilt? Regret? I wasn't sure. Whatever it was, I smothered it before it could surface. This was what I had planned, what I had wanted. Leah had betrayed me, destroyed our marriage, and I had exacted my revenge. This was justice, wasn't it? I opened the door quietly and stepped inside. Leah didn't move. She didn't even flinch as I approached, sitting beside her on the bed. The silence between us was heavy, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on both of us. I expected her to say something, to lash out, to scream at me for what I had done, but she didn't. She just sat there, empty, broken. Leah, I said quietly, my voice softer than I intended. I didn't want it to come to this. She didn't respond. She just stared ahead, her gaze unfocused, distant. I could see the tear stains on her cheeks, her lips slightly parted as if she was struggling to find the air to breathe. Her entire body seemed to sag under the weight of her defeat. I had no choice, I continued, my voice steady, but lacking the confidence I had expected to feel. You left me no choice. Still nothing. She didn't even blink. I had destroyed her life, her career, her relationships, her self-worth. And now, as I sat next to her, the enormity of what I had done settled over me like a dark cloud. I had won the game, but the victory felt hollow, devoid of the satisfaction I had been chasing for so long. Revenge had been my driving force for months, but now, sitting in the silence, I was left with only the echoes of what we had once been. For a brief moment, I wondered if it had been worth it. I had regained control, taken back my power, but at what cost? Leah's destruction had been my sole focus for so long that I hadn't stopped to consider what came after. What was left for me now? What was left of us? Leah finally moved, her shoulders trembling as she let out a shaky breath. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since the confrontation at the dinner table. Her expression was unreadable. No anger, no sadness, just a deep, hollow emptiness that mirrored the void I was beginning to feel inside. I loved you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I did. Once. Her words hung in the air between us, a faint echo of a time that felt so far removed from the present. There had been a time when we loved each other, when our life together had been filled with something real, something worth fighting for. But that had been before. Before the lies, before the betrayal, before I had torn everything apart in my quest for revenge. I know, I said, my voice tight. For the first time, I allowed myself to look at her not as the enemy, not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as the woman I had once loved. And for a fleeting moment, I saw a glimpse of the Leah I had fallen in love with, the woman who had been my partner, my confidant, my everything. But that woman was gone now, replaced by the hollow shell sitting beside me. Leah let out a soft, bitter laugh, shaking her head slightly. You got what you wanted, Daniel. You've destroyed me. Are you happy now? The question cut deeper than I expected. Was I happy? I wasn't sure anymore. In the moments leading up to the final confrontation, I had convinced myself that I would feel a sense of triumph, of vindication. But now, with Leah sitting broken beside me, all I felt was an overwhelming sense of emptiness. I had taken everything from her, but in doing so, I had taken something from myself too. I don't know, I admitted quietly, the words surprising even me. Leah stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine for something, an explanation, an answer, maybe even an apology. But I had none to give. I had been so consumed by my need for revenge that I hadn't stopped to consider the consequences, the toll it would take on both of us. The silence stretched between us once more, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to say something to break the tension, but there was nothing left to say. Everything had been laid bare, the game was over, and I had won. But it didn't feel like a victory anymore. Leah finally stood, her movements slow and deliberate as if she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She didn't look at me as she walked toward the door, pausing only for a moment before stepping out of the room and leaving me alone with the wreckage of what I had done. I didn't follow her. I couldn't. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the space she had just occupied, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. I had spent months planning this moment, and now that it had come, all I could feel was a deep, gnawing emptiness. Revenge, I realized, had been the only thing keeping me going. It had fueled me, consumed me, driven every decision I had made since the moment I discovered Leah's betrayal. And now that it was over, now that I had achieved my goal, I was left with nothing but the hollow remnants of a life I had destroyed. Not just Leah's life, mine too. As the hours ticked by, I found myself thinking back to the beginning, to the life we had built together, to the love we had once shared. Somewhere along the way, that love had been lost, buried beneath lies and betrayal and the burning need for vengeance. But in the end, what had it all been for? What had I truly gained? I stood slowly, the weight of my actions pressing down on me like a physical force. The house was dark and quiet, filled with the echoes of the life we had once lived. I walked to the window and looked out into the night, the city lights twinkling in the distance, indifferent to the destruction I had wrought. I had won the game, but in doing so, I had lost everything. In the days following the dinner party, I found myself haunted by a strange sense of emptiness. I should have felt victorious. After all, I had meticulously executed every part of my plan, destroying Leah's career, ruining her personal relationships, and finally publicly exposing her affair. She had nothing left, and yet neither did I. I would sit in the kitchen in the morning, staring out the window, waiting for the rush of satisfaction that I had expected to hit me after I dismantled her life. But the feeling never came. Instead, there was only silence, an eerie, suffocating silence that seemed to settle over the house like a heavy fog. Leah was still here, physically at least. She moved about the house like a ghost, her presence thin and haunting. She no longer looked at me with anger or betrayal. She didn't even acknowledge me most days, drifting past me like a shadow. I had wanted to hurt her, to make her feel the same devastation I had felt when I discovered her infidelity. But now, as I watched her in this hollow state, I couldn't help but wonder if I had gone too far. Had I become the monster I once believed her to be? She spent her days in the living room, curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the television. Sometimes I wasn't even sure if it was on or if she was just staring at her own reflection in the black screen. At night, she barely slept, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow, like she hadn't closed them for days. I had taken everything from her, and now I had nothing left to take. But it wasn't just Leah who had changed. I felt it too, the subtle shift in my own reflection when I caught sight of myself in the mirror. I had always seen myself as a man in control, calculating and measured, but now I wasn't sure who I was anymore. The thrill of revenge, the fire that had fueled me for so long, had burned out, leaving behind a cold, empty shell. One morning, I found myself standing at the kitchen sink, washing a coffee cup that hadn't been used. Washing a cup. It was Leah's cup from the days when she used to sit across from me, smiling, her eyes bright and full of life. I scrubbed the cup absently, the water running over my hands, scalding but dull, like the pain I had expected to feel but couldn't quite reach. I wasn't sure when it happened, but at some point I realized I had been holding onto that cup for far too long. The moment stretched, time slowed, and I felt the crushing weight of everything settle on me. This wasn't just Leah's destruction, it was mine too. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that echoed in your bones, reminding you of the void left behind by the life that had once filled it. We had built a life here, Leah and I, and now all that remained were the ruins of what I had torn apart in my obsession with revenge. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that I hadn't seen Leah in hours. There was no sound from the living room, no quiet footsteps from the hallway. It was an unnatural stillness, and for the first time, a flicker of concern broke through the haze of my thoughts. I got out of bed and walked through the darkened house, my footsteps muted by the thick carpet. The living room was empty, the couch where Leah had spent so many hours abandoned. The kitchen was dark too, the cup I had washed earlier still sitting on the counter. I moved toward the hallway, my pulse quickening for reasons I didn't fully understand. The door to the bedroom was open just a crack, the dim light from inside casting a faint glow into the hall. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking slightly in the silence. Leah was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to me. Her posture was stiff, her shoulders tense, and I could hear her quiet, shallow breathing. She didn't turn around when I entered the room, didn't acknowledge me at all. For a moment, I just stood there watching her, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence between us. "Leah," I said finally, my voice low and uncertain. She didn't move, didn't respond. I took a step closer, the weight of everything I had done hanging between us like a thick fog. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory anymore. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss and realizing that there was nothing left to catch you if you fell. "Leah," I said again, my voice softer this time. But the words wouldn't come. What could I say? What was there left to say? Leah stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled, and for the first time in days, she turned to face me. Her eyes, once so full of emotion, whether it was love, anger, or betrayal, were now empty. There was nothing left in them, no spark of life, no trace of the woman I had known for so many years. "I'm leaving," she said quietly, her voice devoid of feeling. I didn't respond. I couldn't. She didn't wait for an answer, didn't ask for permission or forgiveness. She just walked past me, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house, and I didn't follow. I stood there, rooted to the spot, listening to the sound of the front door opening and then closing softly behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she had been. The house felt colder, darker, like it had been drained of whatever life had remained within its walls. Leah was gone. I had won, but in the end, it didn't feel like winning at all.